Hey guys, so we did our presentation on the article, Did Women and Candidates of Color Lead or Ride the Democratic Wave in 2018 by Frog et al. So for some key terms definitions that appear in the article, we have recruitment, which would be the process of seeking out and encouraging candidates to run for office, which is often organized by political parties. And we have talked about this before in this class when we read that article by Melody Crowder-Meyer, Gender Recruitment Without Trying, which talks about the role that gender plays within the party recruitment process. We also have voter demand, which in this context would mean voters choosing candidates due to each candidate's perceived gender, racial, or ethnic identification. And this is referred to in the article as a demand side factor, borrowing a term from economics. We also have candidate supply, which would be the candidates who run for electoral contests, and this would be the supply side factor. We also have what's called party fit, which is the ideological conformity within the political party. And we also have intersectionality, which is a overall theme in this article, which refers to the overlapping nature of different social identities, such as race, gender, and sex. So the authors of this article did not write this in like a direct response to anybody in particular, but it was rather a more general rebuttal to those who were predicting a Democratic wave in 2018 because of voter demand for more diversity within the candidate pool. And this article is really meant to be a pushback on the popular narrative that was being touted by media pundits that 2018 was the quote unquote year of the woman. And on the bottom left here, we have this photo montage that was done by Vox that accompanied their November 2018 article about the elections. And on the bottom right, we have the January 2018 cover for Time magazine. And we also see a lot of other media outlets that have variants of this Year of the Woman idea. It could be seen in the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and a lot more outlets that tend to be more left-leaning. So for a little bit of background, the number of women and candidates of color that were running for House seats was so high in 2018 that for the first time on record, white men were the minority of Democratic House nominees. And although both parties have been increasing their recruitment efforts for female candidates, the Democratic Party tends to recruit and fund more female candidates than the Republican Party does. And this can be seen in the number of Democratic women in Congress and how that has increased dramatically since the 1980s, while the number for Republican women has barely changed in that same time frame. And it's important to note that among all this progress and strides towards equity that has been made over the past 5 or 10 years, it's still needs to be said that 90% of elected officials in the United States are white, 71% are men, and 65% are white men. So we still have a ways to go.
So this study has 3 hypotheses. One is about the supply side factor, the second one is about the partisan factor, and the third one is about whether or not the name appears on the ballot. So starting with hypothesis number 1, we can see the first part about it is the proportion of general election winners that are women will be greater in 2018 than in 2016, 2014, and 2012. In the second part of that hypothesis, we see the portion of general election winners that are racial and ethnic minorities will be greater in 2018 than in 2016, 2014, and 2012. And we see in the third part, which is where the intersectionalities come all to play, we can see the proportion of general election winners that are women of color will be greater in 2018 than 2016, 2014, and 2012. And hypothesis 2, which is more about the partisan side, we see the proportion of general election winners that are Republican will be less than or equal to the proportion in 2018 than 2016, 2014, and 2012. On the second part, we see the proportion of general election winners that are Republican racial minorities will be less than or equal to the proportion in 2018, 2016, 2014, and 2012. And then in the third part, we see how voter identification and gender and race all come into play. So all these 3 intersectionalities The proportion of general election winners that are Republican of color will be less than or equal to the proportion in 2018 than in 2016, 2012, 2014, and 2012. And then the third one has to do with whether or not the name appears on the ballot. Whether you're a woman, racial or ethnic minority, or intersectionality between both of those two together. So in the first part, we see restricting the analysis of these elections in which women candidates on the ballot, the proportion of general election winners that are women in 2018 will be less than or equal to the proportion in 2016, 2014, and 2012. Restricting the analysis to those elections in which a candidate of color is on the ballot, the proportion of general election winners that are racial, ethnic minorities in 2018 will be less than or equal to the proportion in 2016, 2014, and 2012. And then we see in the third part, it says restricting the analysis to these elections in which a woman of color candidate is on the ballot, the proportion of general election winners that are women of color in 2018 will be less than or equal to the proportion in 2016, 2014, 2012. So if we just state the results, we can see that in 2018 election, women, racial, ethnic minorities, and women of color won more election than in previous years. But that doesn't mean that this has been by far the farthest elections that they have won. The partisan wave was instrumental in these increases. In fact, we view the proportion of Republican winners over time, and we find a decline in 2018. The decline is occurring with racial minorities, so about 35%, and women of color, WOC, about 40%. Also, the role of candidate supply and structuring an increase in state legislative representation by women and racial ethnic minorities has decreased in 2018. So for racial ethnic minorities and women of color, were less likely to win their election. Women's win rate dropped by 50%. Women of color's win rate dropped by 67.9%, which is almost 10% lower than actually in 2012, I mean. So the main claims and findings of the study was that partisan recruitment really creates a big difference. So partisan recruitment increases Democratic candidates rather than Republican. The party influences candidate emergence. Democratic Party is more invested in recruitment for racial and ethnic minorities. Representation of Republican women and Republican candidates have decreased. Increase in the recruitment and support of women candidates and candidates of color are the main factors in a more representational change that we have seen. More women and candidates of color are winning office. Something interesting that I found was that the wave of women running and getting elected is not due to the demand side, so the voter demand, but it's rather the supply side. It is really, it is more because women are running rather than by voter demands.
All right, so right off the bat, my first criticism is in regard to the article's introductory paragraphs being irrelevant to its theme or main focus. The theme of this paper is on the performance of women and racial or ethnic minority candidates in elections for state legislatures across the country. However, in the first two paragraphs, the authors solely discuss the statistics that were reported in the outcomes of federal legislature elections. There is a striking difference between federal and state elections. To compare the performances of those running for state legislature to those who have ran for federal legislature is to compare apples to oranges. This is so simply for the reason that they are running for positions in two totally different forms of government in the U.S., in which federal elections typically receive more emphasis of importance in the process of partisan descriptive representation. In other words, how candidates are chosen or recruited is very likely to be different among state and federal candidates. The authors do not acknowledge this drastic switch in themes after the second paragraph, and nor do they fluidly transition to the topic of state elections. Rather, they just jump right into it as if the reader wouldn't notice it at all. Additionally, although the statistics reported in the introductory paragraph are accurate in their own respective subject matter, this transition diminishes such in that these facts and statistics do not represent the following conversation or matter at hand. This is to be classified as an overreach attempt by the authors. And overall, this means that this introductory section is rather redundant in its information, as well as its left-leaning sources that the authors cited, like Vox and New York Times. For example, the authors make the claim that, according to surveys taken before the 2018 midterm elections, they indicate that women of color were the ideal candidates for Democrats. While this may hold true to a certain extent, this is relative to federal elections. However, in regard to state elections, this statement means nothing, as we can see in the data inserted in the tables of this article. Furthermore, this next critique is rather minor to the latter. Nevertheless, the authors use the terms diverse and diversity non-specifically. It is most often used to represent racial diversity amongst people of color in comparison to white people or white men throughout the paper, though it is also used as an umbrella term for diversity to encompass women in general, people of color in general, and then very specifically women of color. This makes it difficult for the reader to distinguish at times what the authors mean exactly by diverse or diversity. Simply put, it is unclear whether the term diversity is being used racially and ethnically, or if they are incorporating sex and gender into its meaning as well. Another critique is that they include terms like descriptive representation, yet leave it up to the reader to figure out its definition. I myself was able to pick up on the word's definition, but only because I am in this class. If I had read the article prior to taking Poly 301, I probably wouldn't have a good idea of what they really meant by the term. And that says a lot about being a poli-sci major, someone who this article is directing, what they are saying to, someone that is invested in poli-sci. Another issue with this article is that authors suggest that there is a prime concern in regard to the competition between white male candidates and everything or every characteristic different from white and male. While I do not disagree with the notion that white male representation is rather overwhelming in government, the prime concern has actually always been that of the ongoing bipartisanship battle, and that's Democrats versus Republicans, not white men versus everybody else. Also, later on in the article, the authors tend to avoid touching on this theme and centralize their focus on women, people of color, and women of color. This is due to the fact that it is not feasible specifically for this paper to compare the classifications of one group with two intersecting characteristics, white and male, to a group that consists of an amalgamation or plethora of intersecting characteristics. Moreover, there is conflicting information in two of this article's sources cited by the authors, Brown, and they state that in Brown's analysis, it was found that party leaders question the viability of Black women and work against their emergence. This creates uncertainty in the reader, as we can look to the aforementioned stated claim that women of color are the ideal candidates for Democrats. But we can also see that later on when the authors make the claim that, and I quote, Shaw, Scott, and Junk examined the success of women of color in 2012 and 2014 elections and found strong support for the adage, when they run, they win. There are inconsistencies in these statements which have brought the following questions to my attention. Who exactly is they when the authors say, when they run, they win? Which group exactly are they referring to, or are they using the umbrella term? And if this statement is true, as it is purported to be, then why would party leaders work against the emergence of Black women candidates in light of Brown's analysis? Another minor critique is that I found it rather troubling given the fact that the authors discovered there to be an amount of unascertainable or unknown races and genders of specific candidates running for state legislature. My issue with this is that they decide to eliminate these candidates from the data set without informing the reader a count of how many candidates were unclassifiable to their research and how much of an error that this could have inflicted on their results. Next, I thought that a second table indicating the success rates of such candidates representing the Democratic Party would be equal in necessity, if not more, to Table 2, which represents that of the Republican Party, since this paper is titled "Did Women and Candidates of Color Lead or Ride the Democratic Wave in 2018?" Another issue is that the authors appear to have also mistakenly misstated a result in Table 3 within the results section. They claimed in their results that the win rate for women in 2018 were below 50%, and I quote again, "Women in particular fared worse in 2018, dropping below a win rate of 50% for the first time in the elections we analyzed." Well, if you look at Table 3, the win rate for women in 2018 did not drop below 50%. In fact, it was 50.3%. If you're going to be a professional in this field, then you can't report your own statistic incorrectly. And finally, as I stated before, it appears that the authors have used left-leaning media sources, which one can argue they had used in order for the information found in this article to fit their narrative better than it would have been if they tried to remain purely objective. And this is what is termed as ideological bias. All right. And just in overall, despite these hefty criticisms that I've just made, it should be known that the concept or terminology for candidate supply, it doesn't diminish that at all. I think that they are on the right track, and that this research is rather new, as they stated that they feel that that there needs to be more funding into this form of research. All right, so questions for discussion. Do you believe that a state legislature candidate's outward traits, such as race, sex, and gender, play a significant role in their success? Should these traits play a role in a candidate's success, why or why not? Do you believe that a candidate's political affiliation, partisanship, and status as incumbent or challenger stand out to voters more than their aforementioned physical traits or outward traits? Also, do you predict that women and or people of color candidates will be more successful or not in the 2020 state legislature elections based on how these groups performed in 2018? Please explain your reasoning.